He teaches science and math at Rosemont Ridge Middle School, where he runs a Hobbit book club and a Young Writers Club. He loves fantasy writing and is in the second book of his SOULKIND series, enjoying his characters right now. He also writes monthly simple science articles for parenting magazines around the country, Metro Parent Magazine in Milwaukee, Metro Family in Oklahoma, and Orlando Family Magazine. Steve is known as the Carbon Knight. Come on up, Steve.
Thanks.
You took my introductory paragraph. Appreciate that. Yeah, I'm a middle school science teacher. That's how I get the black eye this week. So I think I'd probably be standing like that. So, like he said, the SOULKIND series is a book I've been writing for quite a while now. And the second one I just completed, except it's in its editing phase, and my wife is going to get to it and she'll tear it apart. So that'll be ready hopefully in the fall. And let me tell you a little bit about the story. Okay, the SOULKIND, or awakening, artifacts of an ancient time. They were once responsible for channeling powerful magic into the world through a select few called the Masters. Once a good and benevolent force in the world, some became corrupt enough so that the balance of evil shifted in control. Powerful forces found a way to lock their powers, and with it, the souls of the Masters. After 1,000 years in silence, the SOULKIND are awakening. Is the world ready for their return? So, my main character in the story is called Jace. Jace is an adventurous person. He's always dreamt of having magic back into the world. He really wants to have the magic, but he also likes to see the magic, like dragons and other things roaming the world. But it's always been a dream and never really thinking it's going to happen. Jace has a few friends, very few, but to him those friends mean the world to him. He'd do anything for those friends. As the SOULKIND awakening is opening up, they're tracking down their old master Turek, who's kind of ventured into the mountains above the town of Belden. And he's kind of gone missing, so they're worried about him. They finally find him in the cave above the city, and as they're sitting there, and Jace is waiting for the morning light to see if Turek is going to survive the night. In his efforts to stay awake, Jace flicked out a knife and began twirling it in the air. Spinning on his palms, flipping it end over end, it was as if the blade was alive. With a sudden snake-like motion, he threw the dagger firmly into a drying log by the fire. Turek appeared to be resting soundly, so Jace put the rest of the wood on. While slipping the knife away, his hand brushed past the pouch at his side, and he pulled out his green stone from the soul wash, feeling its smoothness between his fingers. A memory flooded into his mind and senses. He wasn't in the cave anymore. There he was, running on the roof of the library, staring at Kathleen's blue robes and not at the ever-approaching roof ledge. Off the tower, he plummeted to the waters below, watching Kathleen's horrified face spring quickly away. He felt the water as he crashed into the surface of the soul wash. In the next instant, he lay on the table with Turek watching over him. No matter how many times he relived this memory, he could not remember what happened below the icy depths. It was almost within reach, but somehow not close enough. "Are you just going to lie there awake all night over there?" Jace asked without looking up, while turning the stone in his hand. "You stay away from my sister," Alar said from across the fire. "We all know what you are." Jace closed his eyes. Not anymore. "You'll always be one of them." Alar turned around to fall asleep. Jace sat thinking of what Alar said for a long time until he reached into the pouch for a particular stone. Memories flitted across his mind as he sifted through them, and then he found it. He was in the marketplace of Belden, no more than 10 years old, with nondescript gray clothing hanging from his shoulders. The memory was alive in his mind. The sights and sound of the peddlers, dancers, and animals moving in every direction at once surrounded him. After each quick scan across the crowd, he looked back down to the ground. People would remember his bright green eyes, his boss told him. Not a good trait to have. His short-cropped, curly brown hair bobbed up and down above his blank expression as he threaded his way through the maze in seemingly aimless fashion, never once bumping into anyone unintentionally. "You look a little light," Jervis Redford said as he walked beside him. "I'll be top man today, huh?" Greasy red hair hung over his eyes as he looked straight down on Jace. His brown teeth sat crookedly in his mouth. Jace resisted the urge to say something about his breath, but just barely. A thin whistle sounded over the crowd, hardly noticeable to anyone not listening for it. Jace turned his head sharply at the warning, and he saw a man across the crowd slipping a whistle under his black cloak before blending into the background. Jervis bumped forcefully into Jace's shoulder, knocking him backwards. Patting down his coat, Jace knew he already had at least twice as much as Jervis. probably one of the reasons he hated him so much. The unfamiliar sound of a foreigner's accent drew Jace out of his thoughts, and he edged closer to hear the rotund merchant speak. Exotic daggers glittering with bright gems lined his booth. "Yes, I just came from Meriton with these knives. They came from the island of Garada. They're the sharpest blades you'll ever see." "What's Meriton like?" Jace stepped closer while the merchant held a curved knife in the air for the people to see. The merchant looked down at Jace and smiled. "Towers, many times harder than your own here. Ships filling the harbor, foreigners walking about, and the castle." He waved his arms into the air, and after winking at the boy, he returned to selling his wares. Jace pulled himself away from the merchant's stand and stories. An awful pit in his stomach accompanied the extra weight under his cloak. The dagger he lifted from the merchant's table poked into his side, and once again he cursed his boss. He cursed being a thief. He pried out one of the stones from the hilt of the blade, not to sell, not to barter with in the thief guild, but to remember. He gripped the gem so tightly it cut his palm. And with that thought, Jace, back in the cave, put the stone into his pouch and pulled the drawstrings shut, and then rechecked it. He fell asleep with fitful dreams of his past. I'd like you to think for a moment of a memory. Something that maybe you've all of a sudden just touched something or tasted something and you're reminded of a memory you had when you were a child, but that memory just fills your senses. You remembered of smells and just touches, whatever. It could be an old blanket that you had when you were a child, or perhaps that you wrapped your own child in. It could be you tasted Pepsi, you cracked open a Pepsi and you're reminded of when you were a child in your great-grandmother's house, going down to the dirt floor basement and just to grab a couple of glass bottles of soda. That's one of mine, actual particular memories. Well, Jace has this ability, and it's tied to his stones. He calls memory stones. Any time in his life that he has a particular memory that he wants to retain, meets a person, has a particular, something happens that's just memorable, he doesn't want to forget. He'll pick up a stone, and he'll just pop it into his memory pouch. Later, weeks, days, could be years later, and he touches that stone. Instantly, he's returned back to that time, relives the memory just like it was happening. It's not a magic, but to him it seems like it, and that's the closest he can get to magic right now. Except for one stone, the green stone that he got from the pools, the weather-worn stone as if washed by many, many rivers. He cannot remember what that memory is tied to it. And the SOULKIND Awakening follows the path of the mystery behind that stone as well. So, in the cave, as Jace is waiting for Turek to be revived, he does get revived, and so the next day they find out that the SOULKIND have awakened. There's a red gem, a fiery magic that is awakened in the land. And of course, the town is pretty excited by all this. And Jace learns that people can become followers of this magic, but they have to be tested. So the line's wrapping all around the city, and of course, in the very front of the line is Jace and his friends waiting to be tested. So I'll bring you to another part where he's anxiously awaiting the master. The minutes that followed were perhaps the longest Jace experienced in his life. He ran out of pleasantries to exchange with Cal, as a scribe who was recording the results. To pass the time, he couldn't think of anything but the test. He tapped his fingers on the table and resisted the urge to pull out his knife to throw at something, barely. Just when he thought his heart could race no faster, Brandon Collier pulled back the curtains and stepped inside. Jace sensed Brandon was upset about something. He greeted Cal with a curt nod, and motioned for him to stand up while glancing in the record book. Cal gathered his book and pen and moved to the side of the table, ready to write. Brandon flourished his robe, sat in the chair, and looked Jace directly in the eyes. "Welcome, Jace Lorfeld." He reached out across the table to hold Jace's wrists, closing his eyes. He bowed his head. Jace took a deep breath and opened his mind to welcome the magic. He smiled, waiting to be filled with the magic of Marathis. A minute passed, and nothing happened. He thought he could sense something in the distance, but it would come no closer. Looking up, he saw Brandon still bowing his head in deep concentration. Several moments later, Brandon brought his head up and opened his eyes, his expression blank. Jace began to breathe quicker and started to shake. Now, just because you cannot learn from me does not necessarily mean you cannot learn from another SOULKIND. Brandon opened the curtain and motioned to Cal, who scribbled something and left the room. And with that, Jace's world began to spin until a guard appeared, carrying the falcon-shaped SOULKIND he saw earlier on the table. The guard placed the relic into Jace's hands. The silver wings stretching above the falcon's black head and emerald eyes made the bird appear ready to swoop. Hope welled up inside him as he thought about awakening this dormant soul kind. What do I do with it? Perhaps you should try to feel the magic. Try to awaken it, Brandon said, sounding not quite sure himself. Jace turned the soul kind over in his hands and placed it against his head, all the time concentrating on reaching the magic. It remained cold to his touch. Not able to admit defeat, he would not let go of the soul kind. Only when the guard brought forth another did he relinquish the relic to try it, and another, until none were left to try. The guard whispered to Brandon, "How do you know you did not do something wrong?" "I know because I taught someone before I came in here. Now, who is next?" His eyes never met Jace's, and he callously pushed back the curtains and left. Jace felt exposed to the world, felt the eyes of the others, felt their fear and pity as they looked on him and shook their heads. The room grew ever smaller as panic gripped his mind. How could this be happening? He stood up, knocking the chair over, and ran out of the room, trying to escape from the enveloping madness. I cannot learn magic. I cannot learn magic. Empty. Jace was empty. He sat on the railing of Nor Bridge and rested his head against one of the statues. With listless eyes, he looked out across the pounding crescent river. The waters looked so inviting. He was coming out of his shock and denial, and grief settled into his bones. He tossed a small gray stone up into the air and wondered if he should keep this memory, just toss it into the waters below with the rest of his dreams. After rolling the pebble around in his palm several times, he set it down on the bridge. What seemed like hours later to Jace, Stratton found him sitting on the side of the bridge. A line filled with nervous townfolk waiting for their turn at the test still wound itself out of the hall. Stratton put his hand on his shoulder. Jace finally spoke quietly. "I was happier when I could imagine using trick magic. Now that it is alive and I can never touch it." The silence stretched for many minutes while each boy gazed at the churning waters below. "So what happened with you, Stratton? Are you a follower now?" Stratton continued to stare into the waters for a moment before answering. Taking a deep breath and shaking his head, he said, "I'm not going with them to Meriton either. You know, I never really cared to go away like that anyway. I guess we're stuck here in Belden." He closed his eyes and slumped down on the railing beside Jace. Jace laughed, realizing how much he had been looking forward to actually leaving the town. "Whatever happens, Jace, if Kathleen and Turek make it and we end up staying here for the rest of our lives, we'll still be friends. I know you probably want to jump into those rocks about as much as I do, but..." Stratton shook his head and climbed up on the wide railing of the bridge to sit beside Jace. As the sun set over Belden, the townsfolk still remaining in line were told to return the next day, and the newly initiated followers exited the hall. Out of the several hundred that were tested that day, only 8 were chosen to be followers. Turek, Kathleen, and Karan walked out side by side, but instead of the happy expressions Jace expected, each looked exhausted and depressed. Stratton and Jace had not moved from their spots on the bridge and stood up slowly to stretch out their sore backs. Karan, that's his mother, looked up at the two and mixed emotions crossed her face. At first she started to rush over to Jace, but then she stopped while Turek and Kathleen walked on in silence. Jace took a breath and was forced to smile. "Congratulations." Turek walked over and hugged Stratton, and then Stratton put his arms around Karan and Kathleen. Karan then walked towards Jace, and he looked back at her with a smile. He opened his mouth to speak, but she stopped him. "I'm so sorry, Jace. I'm so sorry." Jace's facade started to fade, and he went to his knees. Karan rushed to catch him as he fell, helping him back onto his feet. Stratton and the others joined her to support him on his way back home. So the soul-kind awakening will follow his path as he's rejected from the magic. After lying dormant for 1,000 years, the soul-kind awaken. Many step forward to claim their magic, but childhood dreams quickly fade under the harsh reality of its return. Who will wield the soul-kind, and who must watch helplessly as magic lies forever out of reach? Who will their powers corrupt? What unforeseen dangers will they bring? Jace and his friends stumble through these questions as they try to find their way in a world where the soul-kind awakening changes everything they know.